mostly just his friends and Pokémon, safe while they strove to bring Nastina down. He also vowed to somehow completely tear down the KBR. They were nothing more than monsters and needed to come down. Ash knew that anybody who looked at him and heard his vows to end such large and powerful criminal organizations would laugh at him and say he was nothing more than a kid with pipe dreams who could never accomplish any of it. But Ash felt differently. He knew that it was his destiny to stop horrible people like Team Rocket and the KBR. Arceus herself told him so years before. Even if he died in the process, he would die fighting for what was right. Sometimes you have to sacrifice your own happiness, safety and desires for the sake of others and to achieve true peace and justice. Ash didn't know where he got such strong inner beliefs from, but all he knew was that when he saw evil and terrible actions being performed against innocent people and Pokémon. It made his heart hurt and felt like it was all literally affecting him personally. When someone cried out for help and Ash was around to hear it, he just wanted, no, he needed to help them. If nothing else, he would make Arceus proud of him for trying. Because when next he stood before Her Majesty and Grace, felt that warmth and loving aura she gave off, he wanted to feel at least somewhat worthy of it. Giselle suddenly walked back over to the desk and Ash looked at her. "Did you find anything?" he asked. She just shook her head. "No. I wasn't able to find a thing. What about you? Did you find anything on Nastina's laptop?" Ash nodded but also had a grim look on his face. "Yeah, I did, and Nastina is definitely into some very bad stuff. I'll just say that everything on this laptop is more than enough to land her in prison for a very, very long time." Giselle went-eyed. "Seriously? What kind of stuff?" Ash sat the laptop down and pointed to it. "See for yourself, but be prepared," he warned. Giselle sat down in the chair behind the desk and started reading the files that detailed every heinous and horrible crime Nastina had committed and/or was a part of. Ash watched as she went through a series of emotions and actions, ranging from surprise, downright shock, gasps, pure anger, and then even more anger. When she was done, she stood up from the chair and said in a voice laced with fury, "That terrible, horrible, nasty, manipulative, evil bitch. How could she do those things? She's even worse than Brutella was." Ash nodded his head and felt his own anger rise at the situation. Yes, she truly is a terrible person that deserves justice in every sense of the word. That's exactly what I'm going to do with the information on this laptop. First, I'm going to print out some of the worst parts of these files and then wait to hand them into the police. After that, I guarantee that they will get search warrants and come after Nastina with a vengeance. Giselle shook her head. "Why not tell them now, Ash? Nastina needs to be brought down for all to the things she's done and all of the people she's hurt as soon as possible." Ash grabbed Giselle by the shoulders and looked in her eyes. "I know that, Giselle, and trust me. She is going to get everything that's coming to her. And that organization she's been hiring out, the KBR. There's more than enough evidence in these files to bring those guys to their knees when the police get a hold of this. I just feel like something big is coming that is going to have Nastina right in the center of it and will be the final strike that really brings her down. Please just trust me in this, Giselle," he begged. She just sighed and nodded. "I trust you, Ash. Just make sure that she does answer for all of the wrongs she's done." "I promise, Giselle," Ash vowed. "Now let's go find a copier so I can get some of these files printed out. We also need to meet back up with Brock and Misty and get out of here soon." Giselle nodded and then the two scanned the office for any kind of copy machine. After finding none, they left Nastina's office and walked back out into the hallway. On the way towards one of the rooms, two doors suddenly opened up and out walked Brock and Misty. They were both carrying papers in their arms. Ash and Giselle ran up to meet them. "What did you two find?" Ash asked. Misty spoke first. "I found out that Nastina is planning on completely destroying the Hutber coral reefs by building a small amusement park after she's done with the construction of her condos." Misty spat out with rage in her voice. "There are plans and files detailing the plans in the office I just came out of," she said as she pointed towards the room she just exited with her head. I really hope you found something that either exposes Nastina as a criminal or proved that she doesn't really have the proper consent to build the things she is, because otherwise, a lot of Pokémon are going to die when she starts construction on that park. She finished grimly. Brock spoke up. I managed to find something that will definitely get her in massive trouble with the law in the city, he said. What is it? Ash asked. Brock pointed down at the papers in his arms. I found these in one of the offices that was labeled, Nastina only, above the door. It was locked, but I managed to pick the lock with a paper clip I found in one of the other filing rooms. All I had to do was straighten it out. After I got inside, I started searching through filing cabinets until I came across one that was locked up tight. It took a while, but I managed to pick the lock, and when I did, I started looking through the papers inside. He gestured down to the papers he held again. All of these papers I'm holding are just a small fraction of the several tax forms that was in that filing cabinet. Nastina has been completely avoiding paying on any form of taxes whatsoever for years. That woman owes millions in unpaid taxes, he revealed. The other three were gaping at hearing this, and then Ash smiled slightly. One more thing to hit Nastina with, he said almost happily. Why? What did you find, Ash? Misty asked. Ash just shook his head. Later, guys. He pointed to the laptop in his arms. The files in this thing is what will bring Nastina and her business, empire, crashing down. I need to get some of the files printed out. Did you guys see a scanner anywhere? He asked. I did. Follow me, Misty said. Ash followed her into another office and saw a copy machine sitting in a nearby corner. Ash went over to it and then hooked the laptop up to it. He selected the files he wanted printed out and then waited while the machine scanned and printed the pages out. Once that was done, he unhooked the laptop, grabbed the extremely important papers, and then ran back to Nastina's office. He went up to her desk and set her laptop back down. He quickly undid everything he did while on it, relocking the files, setting the passcodes back up, and then powered it down. He even had Pikachu use a weak electric current to quickly recharge the battery in the computer so Nastina wouldn't find it being low on power. Once he was done, Ash looked around the office and made sure that everything was the way it was before he and Giselle came through it. Satisfied, he left the office, locking the door behind him. Meeting back up with his friends, he asked them all. Did you make sure that everything was exactly the way you found? He asked urgently. I double-checked everything in every room I visited, Ash. Nothing is out of place, Misty confirmed. Same thing here, Ash. Everything looks exactly how I found it, Brock said. Ash nodded. Great job, guys. Now let's get back to the rooms, and then me and Misty have to return the 13th floor key. He looked at Brock. We're going to have to put all of the papers we have inside the pack you brought, Brock. We can't be seen carrying any kind of papers with us. It'll look really suspicious if we are, he explained. Brock nodded and removed the pack he had on his back. They all carefully placed the papers they had into the pack and then headed back towards the elevator once they were done. Once inside, Ash pressed the button that would return them to the ground floor, and then they all waited as the elevator made its descent. Suddenly, Misty voiced a concern. Hey guys. When this elevator is being used to go back and forth between the 13th floor. How do all of the other people, the guests and employees, get to the other 12 public floors? If this is the only one, then people would have been bound to notice the absence of the elevator. The employees would have known right away what was wrong, and after realizing that Nastina is gone right now and all of the other employees are counted for, they would know that someone else was up on the 13th floor. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Ash shook his head. While that is a really nice observation, Misty, don't worry about it. I think that once this elevator starts being used to travel between the ground and 13th floor, a second elevator is activated and comes down from the other side. This would make sense since guests would still be able to use an elevator like normal to reach the other public floors. In fact, when this elevator gets onto the second track and starts making its way up here, I think I've heard what sounds like something settling into place where the elevator that we're in now once sat. I think the sound is another elevator taking this one's place. Then once this one comes back, the second elevator goes back into disuse again. He explained. Misty let out a sigh. I really hope that's true, or otherwise all of our careful planning will have been for nothing. Ash smiled. Don't worry, Misty, I think we're okay now. He assured her. A few seconds later the elevator came back down to the ground and they exited the elevator after Ash withdrew the key and covered the secret panels back up again. They stepped out into the lobby looking completely inconspicuous and looked towards the concierge desk. As Arceus would have it, there was a different desk clerk taking his shift now, which worked out perfectly for them. Ash hung back and went over to a nearby brochure rack and started perusing the different attractions that Hutber Port offered while Brock, Misty and Giselle walked up to the desk. Excuse me? Misty asked the desk clerk. The desk clerk, an older man with slightly graying hair, smiled and asked, How may I be of service? Well, you see, my friends and I. Misty pointed at Brock and Giselle. Are looking for the perfect side of beach to go down while staying here in this beautiful city. Can you please help? She asked nicely. The concierge smiled again. Yes, I would love to help. Let me show you a map of the city. He looked around and found what he was looking for. He pulled out from behind the counter the same map that the last desk clerk used to help Misty and then started pointing out the different popular beach spots outside of the city to the three of them. While his friends were keeping the man distracted, Ash slipped behind the counter and quickly returned the key to its place before sneaking back out and then signaled to his friends that he was done. He then made his way towards the elevator nonchalantly. Misty looked at Brock and Giselle. I think this beach here seems good, right guys? She asked, pointing to a random spot on the map. The other two just nodded their heads. Yeah, sounds good to me, Misty. Brock said. Same here. Giselle agreed. They thanked the desk clerk and then made their way back to the elevator where Ash was waiting inconspicuously. After taking the elevator back up to their floor, they walked back to their rooms and then shut and locked the door behind them. After taking seats in the living area, Misty said, All right, Ash, tell us about what you found and what those papers detail. Ash just handed the papers into Misty's hands. I warn you, Misty. The stuff in here is really nasty and disturbing. He said. Misty and Brock each took turns reading the papers that detailed every major crime Nastina had committed. Ash watched as Brock and Misty's faces went through the same facial expressions that Giselle had made when she read the files in Nastina's office. By the time they were done, they both were beyond angry. How could she do those things? Misty fumed. Brock was a little more calm. That KBR sounds like trouble. Hopefully all of this will be evidence enough that the police can also use it to take them down as well. Or at the least, really harm their organization. He said. Ash nodded. That's what I'm hoping, but I don't know. The only thing I really care about right now is stopping Nastina. I just hope we get the opportunity before she makes any more attempts at hurting those Tentacruel and Tentacruel. Everyone remained silent for a little while after that. I'm going to go check on Horsey. Misty said as she got up and left the room. Pikachu settled in Ash's lap and fell asleep shortly after once Ash started scratching the back of his ears. So now we just wait? Giselle asked. Ash leaned back in his chair. Yeah. Now we wait. XXXXXXXXX. Meanwhile, Jessie, James and Meowth were heading towards the construction zone over top of the coral reefs in a boat that they had borrowed. They were dressed in their exterminator outfits so no one would recognize them from Team Rocket and had 3 barrels of their stun sauce. Today is the day we get rid of those Tentacruel and Tentacruel and get that money. Jessie said determinedly. Paying our debt to the organization completely off. James continued. And restoring our funding so we can finally build better machines to catch that Pikachu wit. Meowth finished. They chuckled heavily as they neared the construction zone. No sooner than they got within range of the reef and Tentacruel and Tentacruel started appearing in dozens. They started surrounding the boat the rockets were on with the gems in their heads glowing bright red, clearly they were angry. That's a lot of Pokémon. James said as he looked around the boat that was surrounded by the angry water types. No kidding. Meowth said in shock. Why are you two just standing there? Jessie demanded. Let's start the plan. James and Meowth shot to attention. Meowth started preparing the 3 barrels of stun sauce while Jessie and James called out Arbok and Wheezing. The Tentacruel and Tentacool just stared at the opposing Pokémon without a trace of fear in their eyes whatsoever. Wheezing and Arbok took opposite sides of the boat and looked at their opponents with trepidation, not nearly as brave as the wild Pokémon were. Arbok used Poison Sting on the nearest cluster of Tentacool. Jessie commanded. Wheezing used Sludge Attack on the Tentacool on the other side of the boat. James followed suit. The rocket Pokémon launched their attacks and just before they could hit, the Tentacool came together in a tight formation and launched their own Poison Sting and Sludge attacks to combat the incoming attacks with a synchronized call of Tenta. The combined attacks were much more powerful than Arbok and Wheezing's singular attacks and blazed right through them, continuing onward and impacting with the 2 Pokémon. The blast sent the Pokémon back into Jessie and James and knocked them to the floor of the boat. They got back to their feet and looked at their now unconscious Pokémon. They then looked at the quickly approaching angry water Pokémon and frantically looked towards Meowth. Hurry up, Meowth! Jessie yelled. Aren't those barrels of stun sauce ready yet? Meowth kept struggling with the lids of the barrels. I'm trying but the lids won't come off. The angry water Pokémon prepared several attacks while Jessie and James started panicking. Meowth! They shouted. Finally, the lids of the barrels popped off. I got him! He cheered excitedly. Jessie and James crowded around Meowth. Quick! Dump the battles into the water! Jessie screeched. Just before Meowth could dump the barrels into the water, a Tentacruel suddenly emerged from the water and rammed into the side of the boat. Jessie, James and Meowth screamed as the boat nearly tipped over into the water. They managed to right themselves and the boat just before it capsized, but they couldn't save the barrels of stun sauce, which fell over the side, spilling their contents as they did. A Tentacool was floating right below the falling barrels and could only watch as the entire contents of the barrels poured onto it. The barrels landed on top of the stun sauce covered Tentacool and knocked it deep down into the water, where it disappeared and didn't resurface. Upon seeing the strange liquid that was now spreading throughout the water, the dozens of other Tentacool and Tentacruel surrounding the boat suddenly grew frightened of the brightly colored substance, which looked almost yellow-gold in color, and began sinking back below the waves and fleeing away from the reef construction zone as fast as they could. The rocket grunts, who had been holding onto each other and their Pokémon when they thought they were about to be attacked by the Tentacool and Tentacruel, suddenly opened their eyes when the attacks and ultimately pain they expected to come never did. What happened? James said in shock. They looked around and didn't see any of the squid Pokémon. Where did they all go? Jessie asked aloud. Did the stun sauce work, Meowth? James asked his teammate. Meowth shrugged. I don't know, guys. I didn't see, but it might be possible that stuff worked and got rid of em. Jessie straightened up and started laughing. Ha ha ha. I knew it would work. Those stupid squids were no match for Team Rocket. Those million credits are ours now. She gloated proudly, like she wasn't cowering in fear just moments before. James and Meowth also started looking smug. Yeah, those slimy fish never stood a chance against us. James said cockily. What did yous twos expect? I made da stuff dat took em out after all. Meowth bragged. Jessie pointed towards the shore. Let's head back to the shore, team. We have reward money to collect tomorrow. Right. The other two said as James started the boat and then drove them back to the docks. XXXXXXXX. Little did the idiotic trio know that below the waves, just outside of Hutber Port in the deep of the ocean, a monstrous transformation was taking place for the Tentacool that was unlucky enough to fall victim to Team Rocket's stun sauce. They were horribly wrong. Not only did the substance fail to kill Tentacool, the end result of Team Rocket's actions would create a much larger problem that not only would majorly affect Nastina and her plans for finishing her resort, but the entire city as well. In very bad way too. XXXXXXXX. Time skip. Next day. Today is the day Ash. Brock told his friend, who had just finished his morning training routine with Giselle and all of his Pokémon. Ash sat down on the couch opposite from the chairs Brock and Misty were sitting in. They were in his and Brock's room as usual and he had just finished showering moments before. He just sighed and started peeling a banana he had grabbed from the fruit bowl on the coffee table. I know, Brock. I was hoping that Nastina would have did something by now that would have given us a real reason to go to the police and give them the evidence we have of her crimes, but it looks like that's not gonna happen, he said dejectedly. Giselle sat down beside of Ash, still drying her wet hair from her own shower earlier on. What are we going to do about turning her in then? Today is our last day here and we have to get those papers to the police, she insisted. Ash sighed again. We'll just have to anonymously drop off the papers at the station tomorrow before we leave the city and hope that the police capitalize on it. It won't be as effective as my plan of turning over all of the evidence once she gets caught red-handed doing something illegal, but it's all we have now. His friends nodded solemnly and understood. Well, let's all go get some breakfast at one of the diners the desk clerk told me about and forget about Nastina for a while, Misty suggested. Sounds good to me, Giselle agreed. Ash shrugged. Sure, just let me feed my Pokémon first. Pikachu instantly perked up at the mention of breakfast. I'll feed the rest of the Pokémon, Brock offered. Ash nodded. Yeah, then we'll go. XXXXXXXXX. Shortly after Ash and his friends left the hotel to go get breakfast, Team Rocket came striding into the lobby wearing their exterminator outfits. Still feeling proud of their accomplishment the day before. After finding an employee to take them up to Nastina's office, they waltzed into the office looking beyond smug. Nastina looked up from some papers she was looking at behind her desk and scowled. You three better have a good reason for barging into my office unannounced, she barked. The Rocket stood in front of her desk fearlessly. Why, my dear Nastina, Jessie began. I thought you would be glad to know that we took care of your little pest problem and are now here to collect the reward money. Nastina seemed shocked. You actually got rid of those annoying Tentacruel and Tentacruel, she demanded. They nodded their heads. We did. In record time as well, James boasted. Nastina grinned widely and chuckled mirthfully. That's wonderful. I can finally finish construction on those condos and then look into building that amusement park I've been wanting to build for quite some time now, she said with another chuckle. Jessie scoffed. Yes, and that's all good and fine for you, but what about our money? That's what we're here for. Now hand it over already, she demanded. Nastina's gleeful look was suddenly replaced by a dark and vicious sneer. She cackled evilly. Did you really believe that I was going to pay you for what you did? Ha! I never intended on giving a damn cent to anyone who would have managed to get rid of those nuisance Pokémon. The million credits were only a ruse to get people to take care of the problem for me. You three idiots were just the unlucky bunch who actually went though. Whatever it was you did to get rid of them. For absolutely nothing. Ha 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 ha. She laughed madly. The Rocket trio just stared at her with wide-eyed shock. What? They all yelled at once. You mean the money was just a ploy? We did all of that work for nothing? An outraged Jessie screamed. Not fair, you old hag, James said, pointing at her. Let me at her, Meowth yelled, charging at her. I'll claw da old bitch's eyes out. Before he could get within 5 feet of her, Nastina whipped a gun out from under her desk at lightning speeds. Meowth stopped mid-run and held his paws up as he backed up. I was only joking, ya know, he said nervously. Jessie and James also put their hands up. All three were officially terrified now. Now, Nastina, Jessie began. The money really isn't that important. We'll just forget about it and go now, she finished. The three of them prepared to run for the office door until the clicking of Nastina's handgun stopped them. She grinned evilly again. I don't think so. You see, I can't have you three leaving and telling anyone about this. My entire plan from the start was if and when someone managed to stop those Tentacruel and Tentacruel, I would wait until they came to collect the award money and then I would off them, basically getting free services. Yet again, today is just not your day, she said as she prepared to fire her first round. Before any shots could be fired, one of Nastina's bodyguards suddenly called out, "Nastina." She growled at being disturbed from her business, and rounded on her guard. "What?" she screeched. The guard just pointed out the office window to the ocean far below them near the reefs. Curious, Nastina temporarily forgot about Team Rocket and walked over to the window, leaving 3 petrified rockets to just stand there in shock and horror that they had almost been killed. When Nastina looked out her window, her face morphed into one of complete confusion. What in the name of all things business is that? By this point, the other bodyguard and the 3 rockets came closer to the window and looked down at the ocean as well. What they all saw baffled them. Down in the open ocean, seemingly coming closer and closer to the coral reefs and construction site, was several glowing red lights spaced apart at different certain spots underwater, moving quickly. The circular red lights shining under the water were not very large, but there were dozens of them and they were all in an almost perfect formation as they swept forward underwater. Nastina and the others continued to watch the strange spectacle until the red lights finally reached the construction site. Suddenly, the source of the lights rose out from the water and revealed that they were actually the many Tentacruel and Tentacruel that Team Rocket had exterminated the day before. And from the blazing red gem in their foreheads and the frenzied way in which they were swimming around and surrounding the construction site, they were beyond pissed. Nastina then watched in horror and fury as the Pokémon began firing Psybeam attacks from the gem on their heads at the construction site. Everywhere the attacks would hit, parts of the condos and other equipment set around them would be destroyed and/or set ablaze. This continued with all of the Tentacruel and Tentacruel launching attack after attack at the unfinished condos, destroying them. "No!" Nastina shouted as she pressed her hands up against the glass of the window. "Those beasts are destroying my condos." Her eyes suddenly narrowed and she whipped around. "You!" she screamed, pointing at the rockets. "You lied to me. You said you got rid of them, but there they are destroying my property. You didn't exterminate them, you enraged them." Jessie crossed her arms. "Serves you right, old hag. Maybe this will teach you not to scam people into doing your dirty work anymore." She retaliated. Nastina raised the gun again. "No, I'm going to do is kill you right now," she screeched. Suddenly they all felt the office shake. Nastina stopped and looked around confused. The office shook again, but harder this time, causing them all to nearly fall off balance. The shaking continued and sounded like mini earthquakes were being set off every couple seconds. Everyone in the office had to grab onto something to keep from falling over. "What's going on?" James cried out. "It feels like the whole hotel is shaking off its foundation." Meowth yelled over the sound of the rumbling. As the shaking got louder and more intense, they all looked out the window again. What they saw shocked and terrified them all. From just outside of the city, rising up out of the ocean as it came closer and closer to the land, was an absolutely gigantic, colossal Tentacruel. It was well over the height of the largest building in Hutber Port and the same size in width. With every step the giant Pokémon took, the entire area around it shook like crazy and massive waves were churned up everywhere it stepped with its many tentacles. The huge Pokémon continued its way slowly towards the city, flanked down around it by several other regular-sized Tentacruel and a few Tentacruel. As they continued on, the giant Tentacruel finally reached the reefs where Nastina's condos were resting, nearly completely destroyed. It stopped and began powering up a Psybeam attack from the oversized gem on its head. With one swift thrust forward, the massive, jumbo-sized Psybeam shot forward and impacted with the construction site, completely obliterating everything that remained of it. Nastina screamed again and banged on the window with her fists. "Damn it all. Vile, despicable creatures." She turned back to the rockets. "You 3 did this somehow, now you're going to fix it. Get down there and annihilate all of those wretched Pokémon. I don't care how, just do it," she ordered. "But," James began. "How?" Jessie yelled. "Dat thing's gargantuan," Meowth yelled. Nastina pointed her gun again. "Do it or I'll shoot you where you stand. Get moving. Now," she screeched. Terrified of Nastina's threat, Team Rocket took off running out the door as fast as they could. "How do we stop something that size?" James asked as they ran out of the hotel. I don't know James, but if we don't then. Jesse began. Nastina's gonna blast us off in a way dat we won't recover from. Meowth finished. James gulped as they ran towards the army of pissed off Pokémon making their towards the city. XXXXXXXXXX. Ash and his friends had just finished eating breakfast at a diner near the hotel when the entire place started shaking hard like an earthquake was going off. The shaking was so strong that the kids nearly fell out of the booth they were sitting in. What the hell? Ash said as he righted himself. It's coming from somewhere out in the city, I think. Brock said. Ash got out from the booth. Come on guys, let's to check it out. He said as he took off out the door, followed by his friends with Pikachu hanging onto his shoulder tightly. When they got outside they looked around and saw that everyone else in the city was also looking around confused and scared, apparently having no clue as to what was going on either. The buildings, cars and even road beneath their feet was shaking with the thundering quakes that were going off. What's going on? Giselle asked loudly. Ash didn't answer and just closed his eyes as he listened for the direction that the sound was coming from with his abnormally good hearing. His eyes suddenly snapped open. It's comin' from the direction the hotel is in, let's go see what's happening. He said. He and his friends took off running in the direction of the hotel as fast as they could. XXXXXXXXXXXX. Meanwhile, Jesse, James and Meowth were standing at the edge of the harbor, waiting for the Tentacruel and Tentacruel to reach the land. They didn't have to wait long either, the Pokémon were almost upon them. The flames from the destroyed construction site behind the approaching the Pokémon was silhouetting them in an ethereal glow, making them look even more intimidating. The rockets were literally shaking in their boots and were using every drop of courage they had not to turn tail and run away. So how are we going to do this, Jessie? James asked. She took a shaking breath. I guess we'll just use Arbok and Weezing to fight them off. Who knows? Maybe we'll get lucky. She offered hopefully. That's your plan. Meowth shouted with his fists raised in the air. He dropped them limply by his side a minute later and sighed as he cried anime tears. We're gonna die. Jesse and James threw their Pokeballs and released Arbok and Weezing just as the first wave of Tentacruel reached the harbor. Arbok used Poison Sting. Jesse commanded. Weezing Smog Attack. James followed. Arbok and Weezing immediately launched their attacks, but before they could hit the group of Tentacruel they were aiming for, a giant tentacle suddenly dropped down and shielded the Tentacruel from the attacks. The rockets saw a massive shadow bathe them in darkness and looked up. They saw the giant Tentacruel towering over top of them, glaring down at them. It ushered all of its smaller brethren towards the city and they started flooding out of the water and into the city in droves, firing psybeams and water pulses at everything they saw, destroying anything that was in their path. The rocket trio were cowering down amongst the swarms of passing Tentacruel and looked up at the gigantic Tentacruel in undisguised fear. It raised a large tentacle and swung at them. Meowth was short enough and ducked low, avoiding the attack. Jesse and James were not so fortunate. They were struck with the tentacle and sent soaring into the city. Ah! They both screamed. Meowth looked back up at the colossal water Pokémon and started pleading. Please don't attack me, Tentacruel. Me and my team were only doing what we did to use guys because a woman named Nastina was wantin' to get rid of yas. If you want to blame somebody, din blame her. Tentacruel looked interested upon hearing Meowth speak the human tongue and reached one of its tentacles out towards him. Meowth went wide-eyed and tried to run away, but he couldn't escape Tentacruel's huge reach and could only struggle when it wrapped around his body and lifted him up until he was eye-to-eye with the behemoth. Meowth struggled and screamed, "Somebody help! Get me away from dis big galoot!" Tentacruel then proceeded further into the city, using its massive tentacles to strike and destroy anything in its path. Even the largest of buildings. XXXXXXXXXXX. Further in the city, Ash and his friends were following the sounds of destruction towards whatever was causing the ruckus. Suddenly two projectiles suddenly fell out of the sky and crashed in front of them. They stopped running and looked down at the groaning bodies that were now cratered in the ground before them. The smoke finally cleared and showed Jesse and James scuffed up and groaning in pain. Team Rocket. They all said at once. Are you guys behind what's going on? Ash demanded. Despite their injuries, Jesse and James shot up. We most certainly are not. Jesse said indignantly. We aren't. James asked confused. I thought that because of us, ouch. He yelped as Jesse pummeled him into the ground. Shut up, James. Jesse hissed. What's going on, you two? Misty pressed. Jesse huffed. If you must know, orange head. Misty growled at the name. The Tentacruel and Tentacruel, the owner of that hotel, put the huge reward out for anyone who could get rid of them, has went vicious and is now attacking the city. She said casually, crossing her arms, trying to play away that she knew anything else. And they're being led by one enormous Tentacruel. James gestured towards the direction they'd just come flying from. A giant Tentacruel. Ash asked, extremely curious, thinking about Dragonite. He quickly shook his head and focused on the task at hand. So they're attacking the city. Do you know if anyone has been hurt? He asked urgently. And where's Meowth? Giselle asked, noticing the lack of the furriest member of Team Rocket. Jesse huffed again. How should we know, twerp? She asked snidely. We were being blasted through the air while that army of angry squids began their attack. We don't know what happened to Meowth. James answered Giselle's question. After the giant Tentacruel attacked us, we didn't see anything else that happened. He looked at Jesse. What if something happened to Meowth, Jesse? He asked worriedly. She just shrugged her shoulders. So what? At least we're safe. James looked taken aback. But he's our teammate, Jesse. Not to mention the fact that I think we caused this mess. He paused. Come to think of it, we may have created that giant Tentacruel. No sooner did these words leave his mouth than he clamped it shut with his hands. He and Jesse turned to look at Ash and the others with guilty expressions. Ash narrowed his eyes and walked up to them. All right, you two dumbasses. What did you do? And I want the truth. Don't even think about lying to me or else. He looked at Pikachu, who looked at Team Rocket in turn and started sparking his cheeks threateningly at them. The two shared looks and then sighed before they started explaining what they had been a part of. Starting with their meeting and discussion with Nastina. Their failed attempt to eliminate the Tentacruel and Tentacruel with their stun sauce, and how all of it had gotten dumped on a lone Tentacruel that then disappeared, followed by all of the rest fleeing as well, leading them to think it was all over, and then finished with their last meeting in Nastina's office, how she threatened them, witnessing the giant Tentacruel and its kin destroy the construction site, and how they had tried to combat the Pokémon only to get batted away like insects. By the end of their story, Ash was shaking his head. You two always find a way to make things either bad or worse than they already are. He glared at them. I can't say I'm really surprised at Nastina's actions, Brock observed. Ash pinched the bridge of his nose and then sighed again. Look, you two. We're going to go and try to fix this mess that you've made along with Nastina. I think you should be disgusted knowing that what you have done not only could be putting thousands of lives in danger but also could very well have killed Meowth, your own teammate. The two Rockets hung their head in shame as Ash turned to his friends. Okay guys, listen up. We need to get to the site of what's going on as soon as possible. If those Pokémon are really attacking the city, then I'm sure the police are already mobilizing and taking care of as much as they can. If we offer our help and our Pokémon's help in battling the Tentacruel, then that should be a big help. If the Tentacruel and Tentacruel know that Nastina was the one responsible for destroying their homes by building those condos, I have a feeling they are going to go after her, which means that the hotel is in big trouble. Especially if this giant Tentacruel gets involved, Brock said. Ash nodded thoughtfully. Good point, Brock. And if that happens, then everyone at the hotel needs to be warned so they can evacuate the place. He thought a little more and then said, okay, let's try this. Brock, you and Giselle won't be any help in fighting against the Tentacruel and Tentacruel since all you have is rock and ground type Pokémon respectively. Not much help against water types. So what I want you guys to do is go to the hotel and tell everyone what's going on. Make sure everyone evacuates and then grab our stuff from the rooms. Especially the papers. Once you're done, get yourselves out of there and come find me and Misty. Brock and Giselle nodded in understanding and then Giselle asked, "What about you and Misty?" Ash looked at Misty. "She and I will go and combat the rampaging Pokémon with our own." He looked at Misty and she nodded her head in confirmation that she agreed. "I don't like the idea of fighting and potentially hurting any Pokémon, especially water types, but if it means helping to save the city then I'll do it. Plus, you need my help Ash and I'll always be here for you," she said with a smile directed at the boy of her affections. Ash smiled at Misty and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You really are a great friend Misty and I can't thank you enough for always being willing to help me." He looked at Brock, Pikachu on his shoulder and Giselle. "The same goes for all of you. Thank you so much," he said earnestly. "Don't even think on it Ash." Brock smiled at his friend. Pikachu. Pikachu rubbed his cheek on Ash's. "It's my duty as your girlfriend to always be here for you Ash. And besides, you wouldn't make it very far without me," she said as she winked and stuck her tongue out in a pose that Ash found incredibly cute. He shook his head and chuckled. "Yes Giselle, that is very true," he admitted. She suddenly looked worried. "Just be careful okay Ash." He smiled and brought her into a warm hug. "I promise everything will be alright." After they separated Ash got a serious and determined look on his face. "Alright everybody, we know what to do now so let's go." Brock and Giselle took off in the direction of the hotel and Ash looked at Misty. "Ready Mist?" "I'm ready Ash," she said affirmatively. He then looked at Team Rocket. "You guys just try and stay out of trouble and not cause any more messes." With that said he and Misty headed out towards the section of the city that was currently under attack. James looked at Jessie. "What do we do now Jessie?" She looked torn for a few minutes and then growled in frustration. "Ag. Come on James, let's go and find Meowth." She finally relented. James looked relieved. "Alright, good plan." The two of them went in the same direction as Ash and Misty, hoping to find their third teammate. XXXXXXXXXX. Ash and Misty arrived in a portion of the city that was under heavy attack by droves of Tentacruel and Tentacruel, though they didn't see any giant Tentacruel yet. All they did see was smoke rising from the fire that the rampaging Pokémon had caused and the destroyed city around them. They each saw a cluster of Tentacruel coming towards them and they went into action. Misty called out Goldeen, Staryu and Starmie, while Ash released Bulbasaur, Squirtle, Charmander and Pidgeotto. Pikachu was already on the ground with his cheeks sparking. Ash looked down at his Pokémon. "Are you guys ready to go? We need to stop those Pokémon from destroying any more of the city. Can I count on you?" he asked them. Bulba, Squirt, Char, Pidgeotto, Pika. They all shouted loudly. Ash grinned. "Alright then let's go. Let's break up that cluster of charging Tentacruel first." Bulbasaur Razor Leaf, Charmander Flamethrower, Pidgeotto Twister, Squirtle Water Pulse and Pikachu Thunderbolt, he yelled. They launched their attacks in perfect harmony directly at the incoming Pokémon and struck them dead center, blasting them all apart from one another. They got back up a few moments later and stared Ash and his Pokémon down with anger burning in their eyes. In that same second, they attacked. Ash began ordering his Pokémon to dodge, counter and attack the ever-growing number of Tentacruel constantly and without any pause. Charmander was taking on his own group of opponents and was expertly dodging every poison sting, water gun, water pulse and psybeam they threw his way, while he countered with attacks like Slash, Flamethrower, Smokescreen and Dragon Rage. Bulbasaur was fighting his own group of Tentacruel just like Squirtle, Pidgeotto and Pikachu were doing. Chew! Pikachu yelled as he struck another Tentacruel with a bolt of electricity and sent it running away. He looked over and saw Charmander about to get hit with a sneak attack Water Pulse. He used Quick Attack and sped for Charmander. Just before the blast of water could hit the fire type right on the tail, Pikachu collided with him and pushed him out of the way. Charmander looked back at the Tentacruel who had just attacked him and saw the puddle of water pooled on the ground where he just was. He looked back at Pikachu. Charmander Char. He said gratefully. Pikachu smiled back and patted his friend on the back. Pikachu, Pika Pikachu. He pointed to another group of Tentacruel and then back at Charmander. Pikachu? He asked with a grin on his face. Charmander shared the look and nodded. Charmander. The two friends then threw themselves back into the fray and started fighting viciously. The only thing you could see was a blur of yellow and red-orange as they unleashed fire and electric attacks nearly totally in sync. The Tentacruel they were fighting never stood a chance as they were blasted away like nothing. Ash smiled at their teamwork. He knew how good of friends those two had become and it showed in battle. He turned his attention back to his other Pokémon who were also fighting side by side. Bulbasaur, Squirtle and Pidgeotto were fighting in a perfect triangle formation with Pidgeotto using attacks like Twister and Gust on the Tentacruel on her side. Squirtle was using Water Pulse, Aqua Tail and Rapid Spin on his, and Bulbasaur was using attacks like Razor Leaf, Vine Whip, Leech Seed and Giga Drain to bring up the rear. His attacks were super effective since he was battling water types. Ash continued to watch his Pokémon battle while he wondered just how Misty was faring in her own struggle against the attacking Pokémon. XXXXXXXXX. Goldeen use Horn Attack. Misty commanded her Pokémon. Goldeen. The fish responded as her horn grew and glowed a bright white color as she charged forward and smashed into a group of 3 Tentacruel, knocking them back down the street where they then proceeded to get back up and flee. Misty turned her attention to her other 2 Pokémon. Staryu and Starmie were currently engaged with one vicious Tentacruel who was keeping them back with its many tentacles, while using Sludge Bomb and trying to wrap up the 2 starfish in its arms, so it could use Constrict on them. Misty saw they were having trouble and called out, Staryu use Rapid Spin and try to take Tentacruel's tentacles out from under it. Starmie you provide cover with Swift. As Staryu spun towards its opponent the Tentacruel prepared to use Sludge Bomb and knock it away. Starmie quickly appeared however and with a call of, Star. It launched multiple star-shaped rays into the Pokémon's face. Tentacruel reeled back and abandoned its attack on Staryu. This gave the pre-evolved form of Starmie all the time it needed and smashed into Tentacruel's base, knocking the tentacles out from under it and then spinning back towards where Starmie was. Misty issued the last command. Alright you two, use a combined Swift followed by a combined Water Pulse and end this. They obeyed perfectly and shot multiple star rays at Tentacruel, each one hitting its mark. One powerful combined Water Pulse later and Tentacruel was sailing back through the city. It got up and quickly fled again. While Misty was distracted, a lone Tentacruel snuck up behind Misty with its head gem glowing brightly, preparing to attack her. Waited guys, that was great. She congratulated her Pokémon, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Just before Tentacruel could attack, Goldeen saw it and rushed towards her trainer. She jumped in front of the Psybeam the Tentacruel just unleashed and took it full force. Misty finally turned around and saw what happened just as Goldeen was sent careening into her. Misty caught her Pokémon and skidded back. She knelt down and cradled her Pokémon gently. She took in Goldeen's appearance and saw that she was covered in scrapes and bruises from the attack. Goldeen, are you okay? She asked worriedly. Goldeen looked up at Misty and nodded weakly at her trainer. Misty felt a few tears prickle the corners of her eyes and hugged her Pokémon close. Thank you so much for saving me, Goldeen. She pulled out Goldeen's Pokeball and pointed it at her Pokémon. You take a rest in your Pokeball now, okay? I'll get you to a Pokémon Center as soon as this is all over. Don't worry, Staryu and Starmie will take of everything here and keep me safe. She looked over at her Pokémon who had now arrived at her side. Right guys? She asked them. Star. They both nodded together. She looked back down at Goldeen and smiled softly. Is that all right with you, Goldeen? She asked her Pokémon. To Misty's surprise, Goldeen shook her head and slowly jumped out of Misty's arms. She stood in front of the enemy Tentacruel and narrowed her eyes at it. The girl got the message her Pokémon was trying to get across and went wide-eyed. But Goldeen, you're too hurt to fight. I don't want anything happening to you. She protested. Goldeen just looked back at Misty with fire in her eyes and shook her head. Goldeen, Goldeen. Gold, Goldeen, gold. She tried to convince her trainer. Misty looked unsure for a few moments, but after seeing Goldeen look so determined, she eventually relented. Okay, Goldeen. She smiled at her Pokémon. Let's take down the Tentacruel. She shouted with a raised fist. She then looked back at the Tentacruel that tried to attack her. You wanna battle, Tentacruel? It just leveled a glare at her and nodded. Misty narrowed her eyes. Alright then, fine. You want a battle. You've gotta a battle. She looked down at Goldeen. Ready, Goldeen? Her Pokémon just nodded and glared at Tentacruel. Misty smiled. Alright, let's start. She pointed at Tentacruel. Goldeen, use horn attack. She commanded. Goldeen extended her horn immediately and shot off towards Tentacruel at speeds that most would say wasn't possible for a Pokémon that had just taken a full-on sludge attack. Before she could make contact, Tentacruel quickly jumped to the side and avoided the attack. Goldeen, use horn attack again and don't stop until you hit it. Misty ordered. Goldeen began jumping at Tentacruel over and over again, striking at the other water type with her horn every time. Tentacruel, however, was easily dodging each attack by merely jumping, dodging and weaving away from Goldeen. Goldeen began getting frustrated and recklessly charged in again at Tentacruel. This time the Pokémon just slipped under Goldeen and wrapped one of its two tentacles around her horn and twirled her around. In one swift motion, Tentacruel let go and Goldeen went skidding through the street and bounced up off the pavement and into a building. She fell back to the concrete and then after a few moments, slowly back up, battered and bruised from the attack. Misty quickly commanded. Goldeen, use water veil to restore your strength and then water pulse at Tentacruel. Goldeen nodded and surrounded herself in a cloak of flowing water. A bright glow was seen from within the veil of water and a few seconds later she looked much better. Goldeen then opened her mouth and launched a powerful water pulse at Tentacruel. The squid just stayed where it was and as soon as the torrent of water got closer to it, the Pokémon tucked in its tentacles and then jumped straight at the rushing blast of water, spinning its body the whole time like a top. It hit the water torrent head on and then started tearing through the torrent, right towards Goldeen. What the? Misty shouted in shock. The wild Pokémon finally made it to Goldeen and smashed into her with its head, knocking the Pokémon back into the building behind her again. Goldeen hit the wall hard enough to cause spider web cracks to form around her and gasped out, Goldeen. She fell back down to the ground and struggled to get back up. Before Misty could offer any words of encouragement to her Pokémon, Tentacruel quickly jumped in front of the downed water Pokémon and wrapped its two tentacles around her, lifting her up in the air above its head. Goldeen, get out of Tentacruel's grip. She screamed. The Pokémon began struggling and trying to free herself, but she didn't get far. Tentacruel suddenly brought its tentacles down and smashed Goldeen into the pavement hard. It raised Goldeen back in the air, who was still flailing around madly to get free, and smashed her down into the ground again. It repeated this process and smashed Goldeen into the pavement over and over again, each time making the other water Pokémon cry out in pain. Misty watched in horror, unable to do anything to help her Pokémon that was taking such a savage beating. At this moment she wondered how Ash was able to come up with such quick thinking strategies to get his Pokémon out of these very situations when she could come up with nothing right now. Misty quickly grew even more respect for Ash upon being presented with a situation that she didn't know how to handle like the one before her. Tentacruel continued to smash Goldeen down into the concrete of the road and after one last hit it stopped and just suspended Goldeen in the air. She was looking extremely beat up and was squinting at Tentacruel with one eye while the other was shut. Tentacruel then quickly formed a Psybeam in the gem on its forehead and fired it at the limp-hanging Pokémon in its grasp. Misty gasped in terror as her Pokémon was sent soaring through the air from the blast and crashed into the ground some ways away. Goldeen lay there in the small crater unmoving as Misty called to her. Goldeen, please get up. I know you can do this, just please get up and fight. I believe in you. She yelled loudly. Goldeen slowly opened her eyes at her trainer's words of encouragement and ever slowly began pushing herself back up. When she was finally upright again she glared at Tentacruel with a fierce gaze and called out loudly, Goldeen. At that very moment a bright light surrounded Goldeen as she began to morph and change both in shape and size. Misty watched in awe of her Pokémon. Goldeen is evolving, she exclaimed in shock. When the light died away and the transformation was complete, a strong and determined-looking Seeking stood in place of Goldeen. Seeking. The Pokémon called out loudly. Misty eventually got over her shock and then pumped her fists in the air. Yes. Way to go, Seeking, you evolved. I'm so proud of you. She cried joyfully. Seeking looked back at her trainer and called out. Seeking. Misty got the message and nodded. Yes, Seeking, let's win this battle. Let's see what you can now that you've evolved. She said with a big grin on her face. Seeking nodded and looked back at Tentacruel. She glared at it and Tentacruel glared right back. Okay, Seeking. Misty began. Use horn attack. Seeking nodded and started focusing energy into her horn. However, instead of her horn simply glowing white and then extending outwards like with a normal horn attack, her horn glowed even brighter and extended out even further. Misty knew what the move was as soon as she saw it. Seeking, you know Megahorn now. She exclaimed in utter joy. Seeking looked at her horn and then back at Misty, almost as if asking for permission. Misty just smirked and nodded. Show the Tentacruel who's boss. Seeking turned back to Tentacruel and then lunged forward at speeds much quicker than when she was a Goldeen. Tentacruel wasn't prepared for such speed and power and took the force of the Megahorn attack full on as Seeking impacted with it. The water poison type Pokémon was lifted off of its tentacles and sent hurtling back into a nearby mailbox. The Pokémon gasped out in pain as it hit the object and fell to the ground in pain. Tenta. It grunted. Misty didn't give any time for recovery. Seeking used Water Pulse to distract Tentacruel and then charge in with another Megahorn and hit it. Seeking shot a powerful water pulse at Tentacruel, who stumbled to its tentacles and used both of them to block the water pulse as it hit. Seeking used the cover and charged in like lightning, her horn yet again glowing brightly. Tentacruel stopped the last of the water that was steadily pushing it back and then cracked its eyes open just as Seeking was almost upon it. The squid squashed its body lower to the ground and just managed to avoid Seeking as she smashed into the ground where Tentacruel just was with Megahorn and cratered it. Seeking didn't give Tentacruel a chance to retaliate, however. From where her horn was implanted in the ground, she spun using her horn as a base and slapped Tentacruel across the face hard with her tail fin, causing the Pokémon to skid back across the street. Misty called out again, Seeking rush and again and use flail. Seeking launched forward at the still recovering Tentacruel and started flailing her front fins, tail fin and horn around like crazy. Tentacruel rooted itself into the ground and brought both tentacles up. It began engaging in a vicious all-out brawl with Seeking as tentacles, fins and horn met each other over and over again. Seeking and Tentacruel were both landing good blows on each other every couple strikes and then, with a tail fin to Tentacruel's face and a tentacle to Seeking's, both Pokémon were sent flying back to opposite ends of the street and into a building each. Misty watched intently as both Pokémon got back to their fins, tentacles and stared each other down. Seeking was breathing and very scuffed up, obviously still very tired from the long battle and the added toll of evolution onto it all. Tentacruel was also scuffed up and breathing hard. Obviously tired and beaten from the battle. However, it was still looking better than Seeking did. Misty knew the battle was almost over and only one would come out on top. Seeking, use one last Megahorn. She called out. Seeking nodded and slowly charged up the energy in her horn. At the same time, Tentacruel opened its mouth and started forming a sludge attack in its maw. However, the attack started getting even bigger and the sludge started looking even darker and more dangerous. Misty grit her teeth upon realizing that Tentacruel had just learned Sludge Bomb and called out to Seeking, hurry up with that Megahorn, Seeking. You have to hit Tentacruel before it can release that Sludge Bomb. She cried. Seeking nodded and then burst forward as fast as her tired body would take her. Tentacruel nearly had the Sludge Bomb ready and reared its head back. Seeking closed in on Tentacruel just as the Pokémon slammed its head forward. With a loud cry of, Seeking, Tentacruel. Both Pokémon collided. A giant explosion from when both attacks collided and a huge smoke cloud surrounded the area as Misty shielded her eyes from the dust and debris flying through the air. She let her arm down just as two shapes came flying out from the smoke cloud in different directions. Misty waited with bated breath while the smoke cloud began to clear. When it did, she looked to one corner of the street and saw, to her amazement, Tentacruel lying on its backside, scuffed, bruised and badly beaten up but still conscious and struggling to get back up. She looked towards where Seeking was lying cratered into the ground and wasn't greeted with the sight that she had hoped she would. Her Pokémon was out cold with swirls in its eyes and was slightly sparking with purple static that showed the sludge bomb had also left her poisoned. Misty clenched her teeth and pulled out Seeking's Pokeball. She returned her beaten Pokémon and then looked at the ball. I'm very proud of you, Seeking. You fought incredibly hard and even evolved just so you could win. Don't be upset that you lost, Seeking, because I'm very proud of you. Thank you for saving my life earlier and battling so hard. I'll make sure you get treated after this is all over, okay? She hugged the ball close to her and then put it away. Misty looked over at Tentacruel, who by now had struggled to its tentacles and was now staring at Misty with a tired but fierce look in its eyes. Misty had to admit that she was beyond impressed with this Pokémon. It was able to defeat her trained Goldeen, a wild Pokémon, even after she evolved into Seeking and hit Tentacruel with Megahorn, a very strong attack, and then several other damaging attacks as well. Not to mention it was still standing even after being caught in the combined explosion of Megahorn and Sludge Bomb. This Tentacruel definitely had Misty's respect, that was for sure. She looked over at her Staryu and Starmie and knew that one of them was going to have to handle this battle now. After some thought she decided on Staryu. She believed that at Tentacruel's weakened state and Staryu's slightly tired state from the battles it had already been fighting against the other Tentacruel and Tentacruel, the match would be more fair. Tentacruel had garnered her respect and she didn't want to hurt it by battling with a fresher Pokémon that was already stronger than it was anyway. Starmie would have been stronger than Tentacruel even if they would have battled fresh, she knew that for certain. So because of that reason, Misty definitely didn't want to use Starmie. She looked down at Staryu. You wanna handle it from here, Staryu? The starfish-shaped Pokémon nodded. Staryu was very anxious to battle an opponent that was strong enough to take down Goldeen, even after she evolved into Seeking. Misty looked back at Tentacruel. You really are an impressive Pokémon, Tentacruel. I can't believe you still beat Goldeen even after she evolved into Seeking. You definitely have my respect. She said honestly. Tentacruel seemed surprised that a human was admitting their respect for it and was rather taken aback. Misty spoke again. You ready to finish this battle? Whoever wins this one takes the match. Tentacruel recovered from its shock and just nodded. It assumed a battle stance and waited for Staryu. Misty looked back down at her Pokémon. You ready to go, Staryu? She asked excitedly. Her Pokémon nodded and then jumped into the middle of the street and stared Tentacruel down with its, gem. Star. It called out again. Misty nodded and pointed at Tentacruel. Then start this off with rapid spin, Staryu. She commanded. Staryu took off and spun towards the Pokémon at high speeds. Just before it hit, Tentacruel dodged to the side and used its tentacles to catch Staryu out of the air and then spun it around in circles. It released its opponent and sent Staryu careening back towards Misty. The starfish quickly angled its body down towards the ground and stuck one of its pointed ends down. It spun itself around like a top and then shot back to its feet. Misty called out, now use swift, Staryu. The gem set in its body glowed brightly and then it shot star-shaped rays towards Tentacruel. The enemy lifted its tentacles up and, much to Misty's surprise, began expertly batting each and every ray of energy away. Even for just battling against Seeking the way it had, Tentacruel was still a worthy opponent for Staryu. If quickly followed up with a water pulse that Misty had Staryu counter with its own. Both attacks met and clashed together. Both attacks battling for dominance. Tentacruel then did something unexpected and disengaged the attack, jumping high up into the air just as Staryu's water pulse overcame the other and hit the spot where Tentacruel was just at. While in the air, Tentacruel launched a quick sludge attack that hurtled down towards Staryu. Misty saw the danger of the potentially poison-inducing move. She quickly formulated an iffy strategy and ordered Staryu, use Aqua Ring and shroud yourself in a water veil. Then use Rapid Spin and slice through that sludge attack. Staryu did as told and used Aqua Ring to surround itself in a cloak of water. It then spun up in the air towards Tentacruel and plowed right through the sludge attack, protected from its harmful effects by the shroud of water cloaking its body. It flew towards the shocked Tentacruel and smashed into it while both were still in midair. Tentacruel dropped towards the ground and smashed into its unforgiving surface while Staryu landed gracefully on its feet. No sooner did the other Pokémon hit the ground and it began struggling to get back on its feet as Misty ordered Staryu to use Swift. Without any hesitation, Staryu launched its attack at the still recovering squid and barraged the Pokémon with dozens of energy rays. Tentacruel reeled back in pain as it was knocked off of its feet and sent sailing backwards. Suddenly, Staryu began glowing with a bluish light and the gem in its center started glowing the same color. Misty knew what it was instantly. After seeing Starmie use it before, there was no question. Staryu just learned confusion, she exclaimed. Taking advantage of the still stunned Tentacruel, she ordered Staryu, use your newly learned confusion and end this battle. Staryu directed its newfound power at Tentacruel and picked the Pokémon up with the psychic energy. It then began smashing Tentacruel into everything nearby. Buildings, the roads and even other nearby Tentacruel. It finished by flinging Tentacruel up into the air and then smashing it down onto the ground hard. Once the attack was over, Tentacruel lay cratered in the middle of the road, unconscious. Misty saw her chance and wasn't going to miss it. This Tentacruel was too strong to let escape for an aspiring water Pokémon master like Misty. She pulled a Pokeball out from her pocket and tossed it at the Tentacruel. Pokeball go! She shouted. The capture device hit the Pokémon and sucked it inside in a flash of red light. The ball fell back to the ground and began twitching and rocking back and forth. After what seemed like forever and with Misty watching with gritted teeth, the ball finally stopped moving and dinged, with sparkles coming from it, signaling a successful capture. Misty walked up to the ball and picked it up. She grinned widely and struck a pose with the Pokeball outstretched in her hand. Yes. I finally captured my very own Tentacruel, she said excitedly. She had always admired and loved Tentacruel and Tentacruel for how cute they were with the gems in their foreheads, and she also knew just how effective one would be in battles if trained properly, since they were dual water and poison type Pokémon. She wasn't angry or upset at the Tentacruel and Tentacruel for attacking the city. Their homes were being destroyed by Nastina. She knew that the Tentacruel she just captured was only fighting for its home, and she understood that. She only hoped that Tentacruel would come to hold no hard feelings against her. She quickly congratulated her Staryu on a great battle and for learning a new move, also thanked Starmie and then rallied her Pokémon together. Looking around, she was dismayed to see that even more Tentacruel was coming, and no matter how many they defeated, more just took their place. I need to go and find Ash, Misty said to herself. We might have a better chance of defending ourselves together with both of our Pokémon than separate. She quickly instructed her Pokémon on what was happening and then took off in search of Ash. XXXXXXXXXXXX. Ash looked around at all of the dozens of Tentacruel and even a few Tentacruel that were surrounding he and his Pokémon. His Pokémon were starting to get tired from the non-stop fighting they had been doing, and they hadn't even made a dent in the forces of angry water types. No matter how many they defeated, more just kept coming. He looked at his winded Pokémon and clenched his teeth. No matter how great of shape my Pokémon are in, this is just ridiculous. It's like a never-ending supply of Tentacruel and Tentacruel. I've gotta think of something else because this just isn't working, he said aloud. Suddenly, a whole line of Tentacruel and a few Tentacruel launched multiple sludge bombs and water pulses at Ash's grouped together Pokémon. He quickly called out, all of you guys quickly counter those attacks with your strongest moves. His Pokémon nodded and then unleashed their attacks. Chew, Char, Squirtle, Bulba, Pidgeotto. They all cried as they combated the incoming attacks with powerful thunderbolts, flamethrowers, water pulses, razor leaves and twisters. The attacks met head-on and caused a massive explosion that covered the entire street they were on in smoke. Ash saw his chance to retreat for now and took it. He called out into the smoke. Hey, you guys, follow my voice and come here. We're getting out of here for now, there's too many. A few moments later his tired Pokémon came running through the smoke and stood in front of him. He quickly pulled out their Pokeballs. You guys did an amazing job and I'm very proud of you. Take a good rest. He then returned Charmander, Squirtle, Bulbasaur and Pidgeotto before looking at Pikachu. Come on buddy, we gotta go. Pikachu nodded as he hopped up on Ash's shoulder. The boy then took off in the opposite direction of the Tentacruel and Tentacruel and ran through the smoke. He finally got out of the smoke cloud and then ran down another street. As he ran he saw that there were literally Tentacruel and Tentacruel everywhere in the city. Police were all over the place battling the Pokémon with their own like Growlithe, some of the evolutions like Flareon and Jolteon and even a few Machoke. Officer Jenny was in command of the other officers and was battling just as valiantly with her own Growlithe. But even for all of their efforts, it was still a losing battle. There was just too many Tentacruel and Tentacruel. Ash didn't see any civilians on the street, so he hoped that everyone had barricaded themselves inside for now. Rounding another street corner he suddenly bumped into someone, knocking them both down. He got up and looked down at who he hit. Recognizing Misty he quickly pulled her up to her feet and into a hug. Thank Arceus, you're alright Misty. The battling is getting really intense and I was worried for you and your Pokémon. Misty blushed a deep red at being so close to Ash and found a hard time formulating words. Thanks Ash. I'm okay. Me and my Pokémon are okay. She managed out. Ash released her and then asked, how is it going on your end? Misty shook her head. It's pointless, there's just too many of them. I had to retreat and on the way here I even had to return Staryu and Starmie so I could run faster and not get caught by the Tentacruel and Tentacruel. Ash nodded. The same thing happened to me as well. My Pokémon battled like crazy but there were just too many of them. And now all of our Pokémon is tired. I captured a Tentacruel a little while ago and Goldeen evolved into Seeking but they're both exhausted from battling and won't be any help right now. What do we do? She asked. Ash sighed and looked around. Let's head towards the hotel and try to meet up with Brock and Giselle. Hopefully they helped evacuate the hotel by now and are making their way out. If we head that way then I guarantee we'll end up seeing that giant Tentacruel. Maybe on the way I'll formulate some other battle strategy. Maybe. Misty bit her lower lip and looked around at all of the fighting. She looked back at Ash. Maybe fighting isn't the answer Ash. She finally said. What do you mean? He asked confused. She thought about it for a little bit and then explained. Think about it Ash. The Tentacruel and Tentacruel are doing all of this because Nastina tried to destroy their homes in the coral reefs just so she could build some stupid condos. The Pokémon are retaliating the destruction of their homes by destroying the people's homes. This city. Everyone fighting against and trying to hurt the Pokémon is only going to make them madder and spur them on even more. Maybe if we try talking to them and apologize. If we promise that nothing like that will happen to their homes again. Maybe they'll stop the attack and go away. She finished with hope in her voice. Ash thought about it for a little bit and weighed out all of the options. He obviously had his doubts that just talking to them would do anything, but right now, they had to do something. Okay Misty, let's say we try your method. Who do you expect to talk to and how are you going to talk to them? He asked. Misty thought for a little while and then replied. I think we can both agree that the giant Tentacruel is in charge of the whole thing. Maybe if I can get up on the roof of one of these really tall buildings and talk to it, I can get it to understand what we want. She explained her theory. Ash just shook his head. It's worth a try Misty. Let's find the others first. She nodded and then the two took off in the direction of the hotel. XXXXXXXXXXXX. Ash and Misty came within seeing distance of the hotel and were shocked by the sight before them. The entire portion of city near the hotel looked like a war zone. Buildings were all but destroyed, cars were flipped over and Tentacruel were everywhere. Luckily, they didn't see any people anywhere near the area, so Ash hoped that meant that they had all been evacuated in time. Oh my. Arceus. Misty said in utter shock as she stared at the city in ruins around her. Yeah. Ash said as he looked around. I thought the inner city was bad, but that was nothing compared to this. Suddenly Misty started tapping him on the shoulder frantically. He turned to look at her. What? He asked the now gaping and wide-eyed girl. She pointed behind him and he turned around. What he saw nearly made his jaw drop and pass out. 200 yards or so away, making its way towards the hotel, was the biggest Tentacruel. No scratch that, one of the biggest Pokémon he had ever seen. The Pokémon was so large that it towered over all of the buildings it walked past. Its tentacles looked thicker than multiple tree trunks put together and seemed like they went on for miles. The gem in the middle of its forehead was literally hundreds of smaller Tentacruel and Tentacruel's gems all in one. Suffice to say, this colossal Pokémon was beyond anything that Ash had ever seen. Save except Dragonite. She and this mammoth Pokémon were close to the exact same size, give or take just a few feet maybe. Even in the face of such a situation, Ash's Pokémon researcher in training and Pokémon trainer instincts kicked in. Being an aspiring Pokémon researcher, Ash wanted nothing more than to study this one in a million Pokémon and couldn't help but think about just how far along he and Professor Oak's research on giant Pokémon would go if they studied her. His Pokémon trainer instincts on the other hand was screaming to him about how perfect of a sparring partner this colossal Pokémon would be for Dragonite. He was shaken from his thoughts by the sound of someone behind he and Misty. They both spun around expecting to see a bunch of angry squid